From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome again to the National Book Festival. My name is Jamie Roberts. I'm a collections care technician in the Conservation Division at the Library of Congress. Conservation is responsible for cleaning, mending, and preserving special collections at the library. That means I have worked with everything from books and globes to wooden shoes and perfume bottles. I am delighted to be here today to introduce Denise Kiernan. In addition to serving as head writer for the first season of ABC's Who Wants to Be a Millionaire, Kiernan has also co-authored several books, including Signing Their Rights Away and Stuff Every American Should Know. And she's here today to talk about her New York Times bestseller, Girls of Atomic City, The Untold Story of the Women Who Helped World War II, focusing on the women involved in the Manhattan Project in Oak Ridge, Tennessee. Please join me in welcoming Denise Kiernan.
Hi. Thanks for coming. Okay, I'm going to take a picture of everybody. Okay, on the count of three, everybody say uranium. 1, 2, 3. Uranium. Ooh, that's a good one. Thank you so much for coming. Thank you, Jamie. Thank you to the Library of Congress for organizing and maintaining what I consider to be a very, very important festival. It's so lovely when we all get a chance to kind of take a few minutes and celebrate how wonderful books are and how important they are in our life in a very, very busy, yay, Library of Congress. And all the sponsors as well. So my book, The Girls of Atomic City, I'm going to talk a little bit about the book. I'm going to try not to get too chatty because I want to leave time for questions. My book, The Girls of Atomic City, came out in March. It is a nonfiction book. It is the true story of young women living in a secret government city during World War II, working on the Manhattan Project. However, they didn't know that at the time. Now, just so everybody's on the same page, the Manhattan Project was a top secret government project during World War II designed to harness the power of the atom, the power of fission. And the Manhattan Project resulted in the first ever nuclear weapons. It's okay if you don't know that, but that's what it is, so that's what we're talking about. There were 3 main Manhattan Project sites. Los Alamos, New Mexico, which is the one that kind of always pops into our head when we think about the Manhattan Project. Hanford in Washington State, and Oak Ridge, Tennessee, which is where the majority of my book takes place. So now that we kind of have the basics, I'll tell you a little bit about how I found the story, because that's actually one of the questions I get asked most often is like, what made you think about writing this book? How did you come across this idea? And the answer is complete and utter dumb luck. I was working on a completely different book, and I came across this picture that really kind of grabbed my attention. And if any of you have books, you may have seen the picture in the little picture well that's in the book. It was this long room lined from floor to ceiling with these huge panels that were covered in all these knobs and dials. And sort of this gauntlet of technology. And sitting on stools in front of all these different panels were these very, very young girls. And at first I was just sort of looking at the image thinking it's just kind of beautiful. And then I read the accompanying text. This was a DOE newsletter that I came across. And it said, these young women, many of them recent high school graduates from rural areas in Tennessee, are enriching uranium for the world's first atomic bomb, only they don't know that. And I thought, oh, that's interesting. And once I got past the that's interesting, my immediate thought was, oh, maybe I'm just an idiot. Maybe everybody knows this story and I slept through that, moment in history class. So I started asking as many people as I could, friends who are history professors at very prominent universities, my husband, who I think is pretty smart, all sorts of people. did you know about this? And everybody seemed to have the same kind of response that I did. I had read a lot about the Manhattan Project, loved the Manhattan Project, but my perspective had always been a very top-down perspective. It had always been, let's look at the points of view of the scientists, of the decision makers, of the people in the know. And those are great perspectives, and they're very interesting and certainly worthy. But we're talking about tens of thousands of other people who also played a role in what many consider to be the most significant event in the 20th century. And when you think about an event that continues to have such an impact on our lives, nuclear weapons, nuclear medicine, nuclear energy, don't we kind of owe it to ourselves to examine it from everybody's point of view? So I kept kind of sitting with that picture and thinking to myself, well, you know, I want to know what the Manhattan Project looked like through their eyes. You know, what was their Manhattan Project like? So then, happily, I realized Oak Ridge was only about 2 hours by car from my home in Asheville, North Carolina. So I just got in my car and drove over there to see, you know, if it was still there. No, I knew it was still there, but just to go see if I could find anyone. And the first person I tracked down was actually a manager who was in that very photo. And he was 101 the first day I talked to him. And just sharp as a tack, Connie Bowling, an amazing man. And I thought, I have got to start tracking these people down because we do not have access to these stories for much longer. Happily, every person I met seemed rather excited to share their view of their experience living and working on the Manhattan Project. Again, by luck, I was in the lobby of Connie's assisted living facility when I ran into a very spunky young woman of 84 at the time, I think, named Colleen. And Colleen went on to be one of the main characters in my book. And Colleen introduced me to two other people, and they all invited me to a historic preservation meeting. And I basically would talk to anybody who was still around who would give me a little bit of time and perspective. I also began spending a lot of time just in the lobby of the assisted living facility, kind of stalking octogenarians, you know, just sort of, you know, were you here during the war? And I'm 65. And goes, I'm sorry, you know. You look great. You look fantastic. So that's how I started to track people down. And as a writer, what I was trying to do was I wanted to examine the Manhattan Project through the lens of Oak Ridge, but more importantly, I wanted to give as complete a picture of Oak Ridge through the eyes of people I was able to interview. So the women I chose to focus on had very different engagements with the project, had different experiences, came from different backgrounds, which enabled me to explore different aspects, but always through their eyes, because it was their voices that I really wanted to kind of come through. And so I ended up, you know, with some girls from Tennessee, a girl from Pennsylvania via New York City, girls from the coast of North Carolina. I also, this is very special today, I also ended up with a nurse who came down from Chicago, and that nurse is here today. Rosemary's here. Just wave. Rosemary will be signing books later. She's in the book. And all these people allowed me to go into Oak Ridge kind of through a different door. So the woman I chose to kind of describe getting to Oak Ridge was a woman named Celia. Celia grew up in a coal mining town in Shenandoah, Pennsylvania. She was actually working in 1942 for the Manhattan Project in Manhattan. Of course, she didn't know that. She just thought she had a nice government job. She was doing a great job at work, actually, and her boss calls her in one day and says, Celia, we're moving headquarters. You've been fantastic. I would love for you to come with us. Are you open to, you know, to moving and taking this promotion? And she goes, that sounds great. Where are we going? Well, I can't really get into any specifics about that. She goes, okay. He goes, it'll be in the South. All right. What am I going to be doing? Well, you're going to pretty much be doing what you're doing here, but that could change. I don't know. Okay. All right. How long are we going for? Maybe 6 months, possibly 9. Okay, don't know where I'm going, might be doing the same thing or not, 6 to 9 months. Okay, so if I don't know where I'm going, how am I going to get there? Which is a fair question. And they said, oh, don't worry, we're going to take care of everything. So a car will pick you up at your house and take you to the train station. Your tickets will be waiting for you. Someone on the train is going to tell you when to get off. And someone will meet you at the platform, put you in a car, and take you somewhere else. And she says, okay, sign me up. And she, buys a new dress and packs one suitcase, and off she goes. And when I give talks about this, people, especially younger people, how could she do that? Just go without knowing, and didn't she want to know? And she was curious, yes, but one of the things that I realized working on this book and talking to so many people who lived through this period of time is, unless you lived through it, I just realized I have no idea what it was like to go through World War II. And it really touched everyone's lives. Everybody knew someone who was away fighting. Most people knew someone who had been lost. And Celia was no different. The day she got taken off on that crazy train ride, one of her brothers was shipped off to Italy. And a couple weeks after that, her other brother was going off to the Pacific. So in her mind, you can't know exactly where you're going or, what you're going to be doing, but it's going to be, in support of World War II. That was fine with her. She very much wanted to do her part. And this was something that I found echoed in a lot of interviews that I did with people. When Celia arrived, it was a little bit of a rude awakening. One of the first things she saw when she arrived at Oak Ridge was the gate. Gates and guards and barbed wire and guns, all of those were a part of security. You could not enter into Oak Ridge unless you had a residence. You were supposed to have either a residence pass or a guest pass in order to get through the gate. Otherwise, you would be shuffled off somewhere else. In order to live there, you had one particular pass. If you worked there, you had a badge that was specific to where you worked. So, for example, if you worked in the K-25 plant, you could not even get on a bus that was going to the Y-12 plant. There were security forces everywhere that would shine lights on your badges and make sure you weren't going where you weren't supposed to go. So you could live years in Oak Ridge and never even see or know about some of the facilities that were there because you weren't permitted to get there. Within the plants themselves, badges would have color codes and other times number codes that would indicate everything from what floor you were allowed to be on, what cafeteria you were allowed to eat in, even what bathrooms you were allowed to use. So there was a lot of control about where people were able to go and where they were not able to go. And of course, one of the first things Celia sees is a ton of mud, because Oak Ridge was, and it's interesting to learn about the origin of this, it was not a repurposed town. A lot of things were repurposed during the war. People who had factories that made pots and pans, were suddenly making shell casings, things of that nature. Oak Ridge, as it exists today, did not exist before 1942. That's when they created what is considered Oak Ridge today. How they did that, it was about 56 to 58,000 acres. There were roughly 1,000 families living there. And these families were moved off the land by eminent domain. Some of them had as little as 2 weeks to completely move off their farms and find somewhere else to go. Very, very trying for a lot of people. Some of those folks had already been moved off their land by the TVA for their big dam that they built down there. And some people were unlucky enough to have been moved 3 times. One by the Smoky National Park, one by the TVA Dam, and then a 3rd time by Oak Ridge. So there was a lot of upheaval in that area. But from the moment they broke ground in 1942 to the middle of 1945, so really kind of less than 3 years, Oak Ridge went from, pretty much nothing to having close to 80,000 residents, using more electricity than New York City, and with one of the nation's largest bus systems. And it was not on a map. And it would not be on a map until 1949, several years after the end of World War II. And so this is why security was so tight. So when you got there and you did your badge, there was a lot of security about having your car was often checked. Your every aspect of it, back seat, front seat, the trunk. And there was a list of things you weren't supposed to bring inside: field glasses, radios, cameras. But there was also prohibited alcohol. Now, this was Tennessee in the 1940s, which was like moonshine central. So one of the biggest activities people had was trying to figure out ways to sneak the local moonshine called Splo into Oak Ridge. And they came up with some pretty creative ways, and everybody had different kind of alcohol smuggling stories. The thing that seemed to work best in the end was actually hiding the alcohol at the bottom of a bag of dirty baby diapers, because that's the one place the guards would always refuse to go. But it was kind of jarring for a lot of these young women and men when they arrived. And, eventually they'd get used to it. One of the women that I interviewed, because she had a direct experience with having her land taken, was Tony. Tony was from the nearby town of Clinton, about 10 miles down the road. Tony's aunt lost her farm when they came in to create Oak Ridge. And being so close to Oak Ridge, Tony had grown up, she was very curious about it throughout high school. And, because Oak Ridge was a secret city, but it wasn't invisible. I mean, it's not like there was an invisibility dome, surrounding it or something. So if you were living nearby, you couldn't help but notice all the trains, all the trucks, all the deliveries, the thousands of construction people who were suddenly showing up. And so everybody in Clinton, Tony graduated in 1943. Her whole graduating class was like, I'm going to get over there and I'm going to find out what's going on. Now I'm going to get a job and I'm going to figure it out. Because whenever somebody would get a job, they'd come back to Clinton and you'd go up and say, you're in, you've got a pass. What are they doing in there? And people would always say, I don't know. But what are you doing? I'm hanging sheetrock. But what is the building for? They won't tell me, So it was amazing how well they kept this under wraps. And funny rumors started, and they kept saying, everything's going in and nothing's coming out. Everything's going in and nothing's coming out. Because you'd see all of this equipment and supplies go in, and every train car that came out was empty. Every truck that came out was empty. Everything that came out was empty. And it's because the only thing that was leaving was occasionally a thermos about this big in a briefcase handcuffed to a guy's wrist. And that guy got on a train and went to Los Alamos, New Mexico. So you had this city that kept getting bigger and bigger and operating 24 hours a day, and no one ever saw anything leave. So the mystery was it was quite intense even for people who lived there. They just couldn't figure it out. So Tony helped me really kind of examine that aspect of the story. Colleen, the woman I mentioned earlier, who I met in the lobby of the who I attacked pretty much in the lobby of the assisted living facility, Colleen helped me examine what life was like for families. Colleen was from a very, very large family. When she went to Nashville, there were about 9 of them who went at the same time. Housing was very, very tight. When they first decided to create Oak Ridge, at first they thought, oh, you know what, we should plan for about 13,000 people. And they blew past that very quickly. And so the dorms kept getting filled, and the houses were, there's a long waiting list. And so they would bring in these trailers, these giant trailers, and kind of dump them on the mud and the dust. And people would live in these trailers. And they had these enormous trailer camps, and one of which became known as Happy Valley. And normally you can see a picture of Happy Valley in the book. It doesn't really say Happy Valley. It says kind of old rusty trailer on a pile of dirt is what it looks like. And at one point, Colleen was living in this trailer with 9 family members. And what they did was, because there were round-the-clock shifts, they would arrange their work schedules so that they would work in shifts, so they could sleep in shifts, so they could eat in shifts. Somebody would always be around if the kids needed to go to school. And that's how they made it work. And Colleen, when she was working, she actually worked for her mother. during a period of time. Her mother also went to work as well. This was a very new thing for women at this moment in time. I mean, as we all know, World War II created incredible opportunities for women, opportunities not only to do different things, but also to make money that they'd never really made before. And Colleen's father at first could not get a job because he needed something that was called a certificate of availability. Some of you might know what this is, but basically during World War II, they didn't want people job hopping. They didn't want people constantly quitting a job to go get a better job because all that movement would create problems for production. So if you had a job that was considered to be important to the war effort, if you quit, you could not get what was called a certificate of availability and be hired on elsewhere. You would have to wait it out for several months. So Colleen's father really wanted to go work in Oak Ridge, but he worked for the post office, which was considered important to the war effort. So he had to wait 3 months. During this period of time, Colleen's mother was the bread earner for her entire family. And though she wanted to get a proper house for all of them, they would actually not let her because she was a woman. So it didn't matter that she was the only one earning money in the family, that she was a woman in a managerial position. She still was not allowed to be declared head of household and get the kind of housing that would have been available to someone who was head of household. So I always found it kind of interesting how it was an interesting way to look at here you had all of these increased opportunities and things were different for women, but they still weren't different for women. So Colleen's mom allowed me to look at that, which was very interesting. Colleen worked in a building called K25. K25 was the home for the gaseous diffusion process. The majority of plants, the two main plants in Oak Ridge, K25 and Y12, were dedicated to enriching uranium, which means separating out visible isotopes of uranium away from the ones that will not fission as well. That's what enrichment means. So K25, when it was built, was the largest building in the entire world. And it remained the largest building in the world for many years after. It was more than 44 acres of floor space under one roof. It took, people rode on bicycles to get from one part of the plant to another. And what cracks me up is if you see, and there's a picture of it in the picture well in the book, if you see K25 in an aerial view, it is shaped like a giant U. Now, I don't think that's the greatest idea for a town that's supposed to be keeping it a secret that they're enriching uranium. That they create the biggest building in the world that can practically be seen from space, and it's shaped like a U. So I think somebody was asleep that day. So Colleen worked as a leak inspector. So she worked on pipes. She spent all day inspecting pipes for leaks. Millwrights would ferry little pipes over to her, and they would present these pipes to her, and she had a probe, and she would run that probe over the welds, and then a mass spectrometer, which she did not know was a mass spectrometer, would beep if there was a leak. And then she would mark the leak, and it would go off to be repaired. Or if everything was okay, it went out another door. And when I would talk to Colleen, I'd say, well, did you wonder what the pipes were for? She goes, all I knew, she goes, my whole view of the entire project was pipes. She said, I thought, what's behind that door? Pipes. What's that door? That's where the pipes go. What's over there? Probably more pipes, but I'm not sure because I'm not allowed to know what's behind that door. And I found it so interesting that people's relationship to their job would often kind of color what they thought the Manhattan Project was all about, what this big mysterious town was all about. For Colleen, it was pipes. One of the other women in my book, she worked at Y12. Now, Y12 was managed by Tennessee Eastman. And Tennessee Eastman, most people knew at the time, had something to do with film development. So Dot thought to herself, oh, you know what? I bet these machines, these dials were turning. I bet this has something to do with developing those little newsreels we see before all of the movies at the movie house. So that's what Dot thought, because she had knobs and Tennessee Eastman all day. Another woman I interviewed, her friend took her aside one day, convinced she had figured out this secret of this entire place. She said, I know what's going on. It has something to do with urine. Now, when you got hired onto the Manhattan Project, there were many things to do. You had to sign the Espionage Act. You went through many, many security interviews. You signed a lot of stuff. You also got a physical. And during that physical, you were, height and weight, and you gave a urine sample. And this woman labeled everybody's urine samples. So that was her view of the project. So she was convinced they had weaponized urine. And that's what was going on there. But, everybody would come up with their own sort of ideas of what was happening. A lot of jokes, they weren't supposed to talk about it. So, people tried not to get too into the conversations. But all of this is an interesting way to look at what was referred to as compartmentalization. That was the key to security on the Manhattan Project, was compartmentalization. Everybody was trained exceptionally well to do their one thing and do it as best they could. They were never given an ounce more information than they needed, ever. And because the idea being, if you didn't know what was going on, you could not talk about what was going on. And you still weren't supposed to talk about even what you were doing. And what this did was, there were even chemists who had, ideas that they were working with. They knew they were working with uranium, but were not allowed to call it uranium. They were told when they were hired on, I know you know what this is. You can't call it that anymore. You can call it product. You can call it tubuloy. You can call it stuff, but you cannot call it uranium, and that's the way it is for now. So this idea of only giving people as much information as they needed to do their job well, this compartmentalization, was one of the keys to the entire Manhattan Project. Now, another key to the Manhattan Project was having this security force that was in place, not just to make sure people weren't going where they weren't supposed to be going, but also to make sure they weren't talking about things they weren't supposed to be talking about. And in addition to what I would call the official security force, people who were actually, people who might have been armed, people who would come up and, ask you for your credentials, ask you for your badge. There was also a sea of informants. And one of the women that I featured, Helen was an 18-year-old who was recruited right out of a diner. She was working at a diner in Murfreesboro, Tennessee. And within 2 weeks of arriving in Oak Ridge, she gets a visit at her dorm from a couple of guys. And it sounds cliche, but she said, this, the hats and the dark suits. And they took her outside and said, Miss Brown, we're wondering, would you mind just kind of when you're in the cafeteria or at work or in your dorm room, just paying close attention to the conversations around you? And if you think someone is being a little too curious or asking too many questions or just getting a little too chatty about what they're doing, would you please, fill out these forms? They're pre-made for you. If you know the person's name, write the name down, where it happened and what they were talking about. And then we have these little pre-addressed envelopes for you. It's an anonymous drop box. No one will ever know it's you. And the envelopes were addressed to the Acme Insurance Company in Knoxville, which I thought sounded like it was out of Wile E. Coyote or something. And they said, this is it. Could you please do this? And so when you lived and worked there, you knew that at any moment, anything you were saying might very well be reported back to somebody else. And so for some people, this was a lot of encouragement not to get too curious and not to get too chatty. And it worked for the most part. And people who did talk too much out of turn, you were simply just not at work the next day. And I interviewed a number of people who would talk about, I remember so-and-so used to work next to me. Yeah, she talked a lot. One day she just wasn't there anymore. And you would just be giving your papers and that would be it. And you would be moved out of the dorm and you would have to leave. And there was a tremendous amount of self-censorship going on as well, which was interesting because nobody really wanted to be responsible for screwing up the war effort. So if people told you, don't talk about this, we don't want this to get out, people didn't talk about it. And in a way, it wasn't, and it certainly wasn't exclusive to the Manhattan Project either. I mean, we've all heard the phrase, loose lips sink ships. the idea of not talking about troop movements or where your kid was, going overseas or things like that. That was very common in the United States during this time. There were a lot of posters that encouraged, silence and definitely keeping quiet about anything you might know or any factory you might work in. It's just that working on the Manhattan Project, this was taken to kind of a more extreme length. So what this resulted in for some people, it could be quite stressful. This was a town that operated 24 hours a day. And you were working, many people, very long hours toward a goal that was important, but you didn't know what it was. A lot of people who work in a bomber factory or something can say, hey, we're finished, there goes that plane, or hey, we just shipped out these tanks. In Oak Ridge, you were working really, really hard, but didn't know specifically what you were doing. And this could cause a lot of stress. So in 1944, they brought in a psychiatrist who could deal with and he described some of the people he interviewed. He said to him it was very similar to almost post-traumatic stress disorder. And he was amazed at the effect that it had on people, especially scientists that had to sort of do the same thing over and over again without knowing specifically what they were working on. And one of the things that they did in order to try and keep morale up, because they didn't want morale to fail, because what that would mean is people would leave, and then people leaving affect production. So they wanted to try and keep people as happy as possible. They created this vast recreation system, and it grew, almost overnight. They had sports teams for everything you could, this plant would play that plant. They had a rabbit breeders club. Crazy. They had bowling. You could go bowling almost any time of the day or night. They had a 24-hour roller rink. Anything, drama clubs, orchestras, anything you could think of. And the idea was that when people had to work so hard, they wanted them to also be able to play hard as well. And they had dances almost every night of the week too. And so, a lot of the stories I would hear from some of these people, in addition to the very serious kind of work they were doing, is how much dating there was, because you had the average age was like 27 years old there, and they're all locked up behind a fence going to dances every night of the week. So there were definitely a lot of marriages and a lot of eventual babies that resulted from those few years. And when you met people, the thing you would always ask would have to be, well, where are you from? Because, what you were used to was, what do you do? What plant do you work at? But you weren't allowed to ask any of those questions. So the questions became very quickly about what part of the country you were from, what kind of music did you like, and things of that nature. And because no one was from Oak Ridge, because it hadn't really existed before, everybody was kind of a newcomer. So people made bonds rather quickly, a lot of the people I interviewed. And some of them said they felt like it was what they thought college might have been like if they had had a chance to go. So when was the veil of mystery lifted? The vast majority of people who worked on the Manhattan Project and in Oak Ridge realized what they were working on August 6th, 1945, when the first nuclear bomb ever used in combat was detonated over Hiroshima. I say used in combat because a month before there had been a test in Trinity, in New Mexico, the Trinity test. There was no television. People either found out by word of mouth, by newspaper, or by the radio. At first, it was interesting. I was trying to get everybody to tell me sort of where they were, when they found out, how they found out. And at first, the big news was there's been some big war development. There's something big is going on with the war. There's going to be an address. We have to get to a radio. So everybody goes to get to a radio. Rosemary got to a radio. She told me about getting to a radio to hear the story. And there's a long address about a new weapon, and they're listening to, there's a new weapon. Okay, there's a new weapon, and he keeps talking and talking. Oh, it sounds like it's very big. Okay, he keeps talking. And then Truman actually mentions Oak Ridge. And you would have thought the entire town was just flabbergasted because, many of them had actually gotten quite used to not knowing what was going on. And now not only did they know, but it turned out that they were a part of something that looked like it was going to be rather significant. And it was this incredible mix of feelings for people. Joy that the war looked like it was going to be over, confusion about how big this might really be, wondering what their exact role was because nobody really went into that. No one took them aside and explained exactly. No one took Colleen aside and said, here's what the pipes were doing. So there were still so many questions after that initial news came through. One of the other really big questions was, will Oak Ridge continue to exist? A lot of people thought they would just pull up stakes and everybody would be sent home. And that was a concern for a lot of people. Some people were ready to go. Some people were like, this has been fine, but I want to go back home. But for a lot of people, it really had started to feel like home to them. They had, whether or not the military had intended to or not, they put all the ingredients together to create a very kind of unique community. And so when it turned out that there were still going to be jobs and there was going to still be things for them to do, a lot of people decided to just stay. Celia, who was told she was going to be there between 6 and 9 months, I saw her 2 weeks ago. She's been there 70 years. So much for 6 to 9 months. I'm going to try and wrap this up because I want to leave time for questions in case we have any. So as we move forward, the story of many of these young women and some young men really just hasn't been explored that much. And I've only been able to give you just a teeny tiny bit today. But one of the things that really struck me, and I'm going to leave you with this, was that almost everybody I went to interview, one of the first things they said to me was, you don't want to talk to me, I don't know anything. And which, of course, in one way was very, very true, or at least it had been. And then once you got them talking, of course, it's a tremendous wealth of information. And I just can't say enough how important oral history projects are. I would encourage anybody who has a family member to just get to your local library if you don't want to get involved with any of the larger oral history organizations in the country. I know the Library of Congress, I believe, has one for veterans. They are happy to help you get your story down. It is a tremendous gift for writers, researchers, teachers, students. The best way into some moments in history, documents are very important. I rely on them a lot, but people are such a fascinating way in. So I would encourage any of you, if you have anybody who you think, your story, you should really just talk about your time. Just sit down at the table, whip out a tape recorder, and get their story down. So that's what I'm going to leave you with. I think we have, how much? 7 minutes for questions. 7 minutes. Thank you. Thank you. Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. Fascinating story. Obviously, what was created here was essentially a company town. And I'm wondering, for lack of a better word, what the governmental or administrative infrastructure was to run this town. Was it all the Department of Defense? Was it the Army? How was that done?
It was a mind-boggling group of government organizations, private contractors. I mean, everybody from Tennessee Eastman to Kellogg to Monsanto to a tremendous number of private companies as well. I mean, in many ways, really the birth of the military-industrial complex. And, a lot of those companies are in my book. There's another great book that was written in the 60s about the Manhattan Project by a man named Stefan Grueff that really goes into a lot of detail about a lot of the different companies that were involved. And so while it was under the War Department, they would contract out to, architectural firms, construction firms. They created a company called Roane Anderson that managed the day-to-day life of the city. making sure people had rooms in dorms, thing like that. But I mean, the size of it was just, and of course, this was not just going on in Oak Ridge. Oak Ridge was the administrative headquarters of the Manhattan Project, but there were 2 other major sites, and then there were tons, many states that played a little part in the project as well. Oh, do we have 2 of these? Hello. Hi.
Hi, thank you very much for your book. My father, late father, Curtis Nelson, was the chief civil engineer building that facility.
The K-25?
Well, the whole thing.
Oh, the whole thing?
Yeah, and I was born there in the hospital inside the gate. I don't know anything about it. I haven't been back since, but...
It's still there.
I know it is, yeah.
I get this question in New York all the time. Is it still there? Like, yes, it's still there.
But my dad is Curtis Nelson, and I'm Curtis Nelson Jr.
Oh, wonderful.
And my mother, of course, was there too, obviously.
Yeah, sure,
So,
of course.
but she knew what he was doing.
Uh-huh.
But I had 2 older siblings that also lived there, and they know more. They remember more about Oak Ridge than I do.
Sure. Did you go to school there?
No, we left. We went to 3 months after I was born. We were in Deep River, Ontario, another AEC facility.
Yeah.
So I only was there 3 months,
Oh, how interesting.
approximately.
Yeah, I'm always amazed wherever I go. I mean, from San Francisco to Seattle to, anywhere, there's always somebody who has some sort of connection to the story. Thank you so much.
Thanks for your book.
Thank you. Hello.
Hi. I was wondering what happened to the people who got caught smuggling in the moonshine.
You the biggest thing that happened was the people in the guardhouse had a lot of parties. That's the main thing that happened. There were definitely reprimands, but the biggest punishment was they took your booze, and the guards were probably drinking it later that night. Yes, sir.
I have 2 questions. One was, were the Russians or anybody else aware of what might be going on during the war there?
Yes.
No?
Oh, yes.
Oh, okay.
We found that out later.
Yeah, but could you elaborate on that? And the second question is, describe a little bit about the process. I mean, were they bringing in like uranium ore and refining it there, centrifuging it?
The ore was actually processed in various other facilities, so that they had a more. Usually it was in the form when it went into either the calutrons, which were at Y12, or started to go through the gaseous diffusion process. It was in the form of 2 minutes. Uranium tetrachloride, uranium hexafluoride. There were various compounds that were prepared elsewhere and then fed into the various plants depending on what the process was going to be. As for the spies, David Greenglass was one that made his way through Oak Ridge, and then he was out at Los Alamos, and he was feeding information to the Rosenbergs, and we all, most people know about the Rosenberg trial. Right. Klaus Fuchs was out at, Los Alamos, and, most people know his name. Right. What I think is really interesting, there was an amazing article in the Smithsonian Magazine, I want to say in 2009, about George Koval, who was considered one of the most important atomic spies in Russia's history, and most people in this country did not even know about him until 2009. He was honored at some event in Russia. There's a wonderful article about him in Smithsonian Magazine. If you search, and he's in the book, if you search George Koval and Smithsonian, really, really interesting stuff. But he was in Oak Ridge. He was in Oak Ridge as well. So, 1 more minute. Okay. Yes.
Okay, yeah, I'm a World War II oral historian. I'm just wondering, out of all the material you ran across, whether you found any previously done oral history or you had to really go out and do it yourself.
I wanted to go out and do it myself. If there was somebody I wanted information on who was no longer with us, I would try and track down an oral history of them. But I wanted to find people for whom it was just kind of going to be my interview with them, because that was really kind of important to me.
As an author, yeah.
Yeah.
How much did you find very much out there though, already done?
There are some places that have been. There's actually right now there's the Atomic Heritage Foundation has something called the Manhattan Voices of the Manhattan Project. And they have been working on gathering oral histories for a long time, and they are now starting to put them up online. And that's a tremendous project. They're just starting to put them up online now, but that's very interesting.
Well, thanks for your work.
Thank you very much. Hi.
Hello. So you mentioned that there are two other sites.
Yeah.
There's Hanford and Los Alamos. Did any of your research actually touch on those communities? And when the mystery was unveiled, let's say, did communities within Oak Ridge try to tap into or connect with those folks in Hanford, let's say, who perhaps may have had similar experiences if they were actually interested in it?
That I don't think so, or don't know. I mean, you have to certainly understand that most of those people in Oak Ridge didn't know that Hanford and Los Alamos existed until the day they found out about the bomb. And some people who worked within the Atomic Energy Commission would obviously, and stayed with them, would get sent to other places, and then I'm sure they had very interesting conversations about what life was like. I do talk a little bit about Hanford and Los Alamos in the book, but it's pretty much predominantly about Oak Ridge. I do know that in later years, there was kind of more of I don't know if you'd say alliance, but definitely sort of more sharing going on between the sites as the idea of preserving the history of the project became important to people. They sort of kind of reached out and wanted to join forces. But there were a lot of people who would work at several different sites, so they kind of got moved around a lot, and you did see, or to places like Rocky Flats, or to the University of Chicago, or Columbia. So there was a little movement between the sites, definitely. That it? Okay, I'm being given the cut. The orchestra's playing. Thank you very much.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.